Alors, passons aux choses sérieuses. Dans cette session plénière, qui est la première, je rappellerai simplement les intitulés. À quoi ressemblera demain le paysage du vieillissement cognitif ? L'accroissement de la longévité, l'évolution des familles, la baisse de la prévalence des syndromes démentiels, les contraintes et les opportunités économiques, les éléments de prospective. C'est pour ça qu'il y a une économiste et bien sûr un professeur de santé publique à mes côtés. On va commencer avec vous, Carole Brayne, si vous en êtes d'accord. Je rappelle que vous publiez dans la prestigieuse revue British Medical Journal, donc je voulais le signaler. Et la question que je voudrais vous poser concerne le risque de démence qui est lié à l'âge. Est-ce qu'on doit, comme on l'entend un peu trop souvent, opposer ce qu'on appelle le vieillissement normal, qui n'est pas une maladie, je parle sous votre contrôle, et la vieillesse pathologique? On doit les opposer? Je vous en prie.
C'est bien difficile à les séparer, mais il faut regarder dans la population pour voir si c'est possible à séparer. Et puis, il faut faire toutes les mesures qu'on utilise pour le diagnostic de démence pour voir s'il y a une séparation. Et c'est ça que j'ai fait avec mes études depuis 30 ans. Et bien, c'est difficile à ce moment-là parce qu'il y a beaucoup de mesures nouvelles, d'innovation avec le imaging et tout ça, avec les ligands radioactifs pour voir les protéines dans le cerveau et des choses comme ça. Et il faut absolument voir dans la population si ces mesures s'expressent dans la population différemment, si on peut séparer les gens qui vont développer la démence et les gens qui ne vont pas. Mais il faut suivre longtemps parce que la démence que nous craignons, surtout, c'est la démence de vieillesse qui prend place dans le vieillissement. Alors, j'en parlerai si je fais la présentation. Oui ?
Absolument. Je
oui
vous
okay.
propose de nous rejoindre à la tribune, ce sera peut-être plus simple pour vous.
Oui.
Je vous en prie.
Alors, c'est un grand honneur d'être là. Voilà, ça va ?
Là, c'est parfait.
Bon, ok. Alors, c'est un grand honneur d'être là. Et j'aimerais bien continuer en français, mais pour le pratiquer pour moi. Mais ça serait trop pénible pour vous. Alors, je changerai en anglais. Alors, je voulais parler un peu de la perspective de la santé publique. And I was very pleased to hear the introductions of your presidents and distinguished speakers earlier. And I will talk a little bit about how we come to understand some of the things that they have talked about. And I welcome the cross-cutting approach that they have outlined to you. So, dementia is a syndrome. It's a syndrome. It's not a thing. And it's dimensional. It covers cognition, and that's the subject of this conference. It covers our ability to function day to day, and again, that was talked about quite a bit in the introduction. And it covers exclusion criteria, so you need to be able to exclude other conditions. When you study dementia in the population, it's essential to look at the health of the whole person. So any research into dementia has to look at healthy aging and unhealthy aging, and indeed, as we've just talked about, the separation of normal aging from abnormal aging, whatever that is. So you have to have a sense of what that is. We have created subtypes over the last generations, and these include Alzheimer's, vascular, Lewy body, Parkinson's disease dementia, and mixed dementia. Now, these change over time. Our concepts of dementia change over time, as do our perceptions of the subtypes of dementia. So that over the last decades, there have been many changes in the international criteria and the American criteria in particular for the subtypes for dementia. And in addition, there have been research criteria proposed. Each of these include slightly different things. And to some extent, this has already been referred to some extent, dementia depends on who is observing it. And that takes us into philosophy, I think. But from a practical point of view, if you're a geriatrician, or if you're a neurologist, or if you're a psychiatrist, or if you're now a subspecialist within these disciplines, a neuroinflammation specialist, a vascular specialist, you will see different people, because different people will be referred to you through your health systems, and you will think that dementia is that thing. But actually, it's a syndrome, and it's much bigger than the thing that is expressed in the people who come to your clinic. So from a public health point of view, we absolutely have to take the bigger concept into account, because it is that bigger concept that is concerning society. And I'm going to illustrate the reason why I say these things with data that we have generated in the UK, and also other data. This is data from Canada, but analysed by Swedish researchers, and it illustrates in the Canadian Health and Aging Study that people who are, if you take a whole population and you measure lots of things on all that population, so as I said earlier, measuring the things that are used to diagnose dementia in the whole population, you can then assemble the different diagnostic criteria in order to identify who is identified by which criteria. And this slide takes the whole population that was examined and sees what is the overlap of the different diagnostic criteria for dementia. This is an old study published in a very prestigious medical journal, and it shows you that the different diagnostic criteria diagnose different people, and there's relatively little overlap of them. Now, this is without all of the biological criteria that have recently been suggested to be added to the diagnostic criteria for dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and then preclinical types of disorder as well. So we have a very complex environment in which we're working. So when I started to study dementia in the mid-80s, so this is a very long time ago, I wanted to look at the separation of normality from abnormality. And I interviewed a large number of women in a fairly defined age group, and I threw everything I could at them that at the time was used in the diagnosis of dementia. So I used a standardized interview, I examined them neurologically and actually generally as well. I took blood, and I did everything that I could at that time. I even tried to see if I could retrieve brains after post-mortem. What I found in a whole population, so I had about a 95% response rate in that population, was that every measure that was used in the diagnosis of dementia in a population sample was distributed in a continuous fashion. There was no separation in the population of the normal from the abnormal. There was not a nice, neat, dichotomous separation. So that in the population you had the people who were doing very well, the people who were doing usually okay, the people who were not doing quite so well but not definitely demented, and the people who clearly had dementia. And there was a continuum between all those people. This is much more recognized now than it was then. At the time there was a real sense that one had to sort of pull them apart and say dementia is completely separate, completely binary, black and white, completely separate. But of course that isn't the case. And anybody who has experienced dementia in their family or in loved ones will know it's a very gradual, it's mostly a gradual process. So we then went on, that was in the Cambridgeshire area of the United Kingdom, and then we went on and did a very long study in the population in Cambridge City. In fact, it was started at the same time I was interviewing all those women in the north of Cambridgeshire. So this study also had a very high response rate, and it was screening for dementia in order to look at care in the community, and it was clear that integrated disciplines into care for people in the community for dementia led to an improvement in quality of life. It didn't lead to an improvement in survival, nor did it lead to a reduction in institutionalization. In fact, it led to an increase in going into care settings, largely because the multidisciplinary teams recognized what pressure the families were under in looking after people with dementia in their community. So we were able to take this study up and start looking at incidents, but I'm only going to show you the baseline data, and then I'll come on to the Brayne data later. But this study in Cambridge City, along with the one in the East Cambridgeshire, contributed to a very important EU exercise led by Bert Hoffman, who brought together the population-based studies in Europe to assess what is the prevalence, and later looked at prevalence and incidence and updated and so on, but what is the prevalence of dementia in the population? This study was enormously influential because Europe, above all other areas of the world, was able to do population-based studies in which we could look at how common is dementia as diagnosed at that time in the population. And these were the studies that had, these were the countries and areas that had population-based studies of people aged 65 and over at the time. And the two studies I've described are part of that. This showed these very well-known figures, which show you the prevalence rising dramatically with age, and the fact that it's a linear relationship, a log-linear relationship, so it doubles every 5 years after the age of 65. The fact that age is important is often left out of biomedical research. The background is of an aging population, and many of the animal models and the background cellular models, such as stem cells, have a real challenge in integrating the factor that most dementia occurs in the old. Most incident dementia occurs in the older old. So, going back to the separation of normality from abnormality, if you like, in the Cambridge City over 75 study, we looked at change in cognition over time. And these are really old data, but I show them to illustrate the point, again, about this continuum. So this is the change in a crude cognitive test, the mini-mental state, but we all use it and we pretty well understand it. In a whole population, we had very good response rates, so there are not many biases in this population. And it shows you that as a whole, the whole population has shifted downwards in its cognition in that time. So this is a general phenomenon. And of course, we're not the first to show this. This is a general phenomenon. We know that cognition does decline over time. And I'll show some norms later, which give you a distribution of the cognitive profiles of people with age. I'm going to switch over to the cognitive function and aging study now, because that gives you a different type of data, and it's also relevant to health and aging. So I'm just going to describe it very briefly. It's a multi-center study in the United Kingdom. It's been running since the early 90s, and it is a collaboration of many, many different institutions bringing different disciplines. And so this speaks to your centers of excellence. It brings together different universities with very different leads. So Sheffield leads the neuropathology, for example. Exeter leads social science. Newcastle has led health policy. So we have different places bringing in their expertise on the platform of a population-based study. So in order to derive an understanding of what matters for the population. This study started, as I said, in the early 90s, and it recruited around 18,000 people aged 65 and over, 5 in identical sites. And I'll present results from both the 5 identical sites and the non-identical site, because there was brain donation in that one. It was true population sampling, which can be challenging for many countries and is increasingly challenging in the UK. And we followed people up for as long as we could. We measured everything we could afford to actually, everything we could afford to as regularly as we could afford to too, because this is all dependent on funding. These were the locations of the in-depth sites where we recruited. Each site had 2,500 people, apart from Liverpool, which was rather bigger. This was very important because we wanted to study whether dementia was different in the north and the south. We looked at prevalence, we looked at incidence. Our findings were very similar to those which we had published earlier in Europe with Bert Hoffman, and I'm not going to show those because they're pretty well known. What we were able to do with this study, though, was also look at the profiles of cognition in the population aged 65 and over. And these are norms, these are cross-sectional norms, so these are a bit like the Tanner growth charts if you've had children. You track a child's growth on the basis of growth charts, which tell you at any one age what the height and weight might be. And it gives you percentiles of where your child is in relation to the population. So this shows you that if you used cut points for screening for dementia, which people have suggested in the past, 24, 25, by the time you get into the oldest age groups, you'll be bringing everybody into your screening program. So this shows you that in the older population, cognition does change. This is not change, but this is cross-sectional, but it does change when we look at it longitudinally as well. And it changes roughly like this. And there are some people who do very well, and there are some people who do pretty badly. And the mild cognitive impairments are somewhere around here, they could be anywhere in here, really. And the dementias will be more in here. But they will not have very discrete edges. So you can't just pluck out and say that person is definitely going to have dementia, because people can have low cognition and not have dementia. So it is always more complicated than one thinks. So this continuum in the population has been confirmed pretty well by everything that we have studied since then, with the difficulty in separating out, apart from in the young onset dementias, which, as noted before, are very different and relatively rare and very important, but they're not the burden to society that the aging population provides. So during the time of doing this research, it was becoming clear that there were risk factors associated with dementia which were themselves changing in the population. There were also protective factors which were themselves changing in the population, such as education, physical activity, smoking, vascular disease. Health has changed in the generations that come after the generations that we were studying here. So we asked our Medical Research Council for finance. I have to say I had to put a grant in 5 times to raise the money to do this, because it didn't seem to be attractive enough as an idea. The idea that dementia might have changed in our populations. And there aren't many contemporary population studies of dementia going on. We managed to get the money in the UK, and one of the very great advantages of our study was that we used a method to diagnose our dementia in the population, which was based on an algorithm. And that algorithm does not change over time, whereas clinical practice had changed, as I've discussed, enormously during that time. So we were able to repeat the same methods in 3 of the locations that I showed you on the map. And what we found was that the prevalence, the proportion of people affected by dementia at each age, has gone down by over 20%, nearly a quarter less. This is massively important, and it means that we really need to understand why that is the case, because it may be those risk factors that have changed. During this time, we also have been doing brain donation studies to look at the profile of people who die during life without any assumptions about what diagnosis they have, and what their brains look like after death. And these are some of the very wonderful people who have given their brains to us. We had an exhibition working with social scientists and award-winning photographers, which celebrated their lives, which was very moving. From these brains, we've been able, without assumptions, to look at who has dementia, who doesn't have dementia by the time they die. Now, these are people who are donating their brains, and of course, by the time they die, they are in the oldest age groups. And in our studies, the incidence of dementia, so the occurrence of dementia, is around 84, 85. So we really are talking about people in their 9th decades. So the median age of occurrence is in the 9th decade. And the people who are donating their brains are just a couple of years older than that. So we have a large collection of brains. And what you see here are the classical pathologies of Alzheimer's and vascular dementia as measured by our neuropathologists. And you can see the dark bars are the people who have dementia, and the light bars are the people who don't have dementia by the time they die. And what you can see is that for classical Alzheimer pathology, these are measures of Alzheimer-type pathology, that there is huge overlap in the people who die at great ages with dementia and without dementia, and similarly for vascular. Those things are still highly associated with the expression of dementia, but they are neither necessary nor sufficient for the expression of dementia in these age groups. So we really need new approaches to think about dementia, because you can survive to a great age without dementia, but with many pathologies in your brain. So what else is going on? Of course, we are looking very hard about what else is going on. 5 minutes. And to see what might be protecting the brain from the expression of dementia. And education, I thought that high education would mean that you have less pathology in your brain and therefore less dementia, because we know that people with higher levels of education are less likely to develop dementia. But it wasn't that. It was that at every level of brain pathology, in the Alzheimer's type pathology, apart from atrophy, the expression of dementia was less in those people who had higher education than in those people who had lower education. So there are very many other things going on in the brain, and that's, of course, is what we are wanting to investigate. So, in terms of thinking about your conference, I think it's very, very important to focus on a person-based approach, to think about prevention, risk reduction, to think about where we really do have evidence for of improvement of treatment, and really to generate the evidence on early detection, because it is a big distractor and it consumes a great deal of resources. So we really need to work out what we are doing when we do early detection. We need to work out what is evidence support for people with dementia. And I agree with the defy cognitive decline mantra, but actually I think also we need to think about our language. We need to think about embracing cognitive decline when it is inevitable. We need to avoid it when we can, but when it's there, we need to try to work out how to get round it and how to embrace it and how to work with the assets, the positives, rather than having a very negative tone to it, as it were. I think it's very important that we destigmatize, and in the a rush to test everybody, maybe that will be an unintended consequence that we do destigmatize, because so many people will be positive. If we image people in the 70s, in their 70s and 80s, we will have a massive proportion of the population who are positive for these tests. And we must think about protecting future generations, so we need a life course approach to thinking about our strategies for dementia. So thank you. These are just some of the people who have taken part in all these research programs and been absolutely critical to their outputs. And I hope you have a very fruitful and enjoyable 2 days.
Merci Madame le professeur pour avoir analysé pour nous les différents critères pour comprendre la démence en liaison avec l'âge.